Okay, yeah, so the Mongols just invaded Beijing, and they had reprogrammed the genetics of Beijing and China and also the culture. So now the Great Tent, or the Great, because the Mongolians lived in tents, that like back on the steppe, they didn't even have buildings that they made out of stones and stuff, because maybe they didn't even have stones. It was just a bunch of dudes in the plains on horses, and so they'd make the tents out of the skins of the horses, and they'd move around following the horses, and that's what they did. And so when they moved to China and they set up shop, their big like central capital where all the kings lived and stuff were in big tents. And then eventually that evolved into buildings, wooden buildings, Chinese style, but that looked like tents. And but eventually after a few hundred years, they became Chinese as well, because China was such a big country with such rich culture that they could have killed all the people in the capital city, but eventually they were going to be like, oh, what's this written language stuff? What are we going to use? What's this cool culture and the ancient religion you have with Confucianism and the trade and all these cool inventions you have? Oh, let's just adopt it. So then they hired Chinese to teach them how to read and write, and then of course they became Chinese after that. It wasn't so much like that when they took over it was actually kind of like that when they took over the Arabic Empire as well. But they destroyed all their books and stuff. The Arabic Empire, I think, was actually a little bit more advanced than China in terms of science and stuff. And they weren't into like reading those books, and they hurt the Arab Empire more than they did China. Because China just had more people, more consolidated society. So, but those Mongols also tried to take over Korea. I think they did take over Korea. They tried to take over Japan. They tried to do their boats across twice, but both times the weather knocked them back, so they never took over Japan. But they took over like half the world. It was the biggest land empire ever. And for example, the empire of the Khans, the Mongolian Empire, was somewhere. Karakorum in modern-day Mongolia was their capital, which is a long-ass way from Poland. I mean, they were besieging Poland, and then all of a sudden they got the word that their Khan died, so they had to move back to Mongolia to find out who was going to be next Khan, to help vote and decide who's next Khan. They never got around to attacking Poland again because they weren't consolidated enough then. But my God, that's a long ways to ride your horse back from Poland all the way to Mongolia. But they were badasses. They could ride their horses, I don't know, a couple hundred miles a day probably. Each of them had 6 horses. So they'd ride one horse until he got tired, and then you just jump on the other horse and ride him until he got tired, and jump on the other horse and ride him until he got tired, and just have all your horses connected. And whenever the horses got hungry, you just stop, and then they'd eat the grass, which is always right there. And like when they would want to capture new horses, because that's where horses are from. There's horses all over up there. When they want to capture a horse, they would just go up and they had so many Mongolians on horses, they just get on horseback in a big line all the way across the valley, even if it was a valley that was like 15 miles wide. They go all the way across the whole valley with all the people and get in front, and then just move their line and box the horses into this one big like swarm, and then capture them that way. Or if they were going to do it with reindeer and kill those that way. And they were good warriors. Like their arrows could shoot a half mile, and they could fire off like 6 a minute or something like that, or like 10 a minute or something. And so when they went up against the Polish knights, the Polish had crossbows, which was their most powerful weapon, but the crossbow could only shoot a quarter mile. It was like a half of the way, and they could only shoot 2 a minute. So it was a lot more inferior of a fighting of firepower, and also they couldn't move around as fast. The Mongolians didn't have metal armor. They had leather armor and silk shirts, so that whenever the arrow hit them, it pierced their skin, and it would bring. They had like five layers of silk shirts that they brought from China, and so when they would get hit, it would pierce through them, but it would bring the silk would wrap around the arrowhead, and the arrow would go into their body, but then they could just pull it out because it wouldn't notch into the flesh because the silk was all around it. And so then with their horses traveling really fast, moving around and shooting their high-powered arrows, it was a superior fighting way than what the poles had, where they were very cumbersome. A pole, the chainmail shirt of a pole could weigh up to 60 pounds just for the shirt. And so the whole get-up would be like, 150 pounds? Like, you could barely get on your horse. You'd have to ride around on little munchkin horses that were short enough for you to even get on it. Those big night suits were really best suited to intimidating just like small bands of farmers into giving you their taxes for your local lord. A horse-mounted knight with his lance and his sword could fight off seven peasants with their little pitchforks. So, but as far as if you're going to go out and fight Mongols, and you're all dressed up in a bunch of knights, then yeah, the knights got their asses kicked. Couldn't move around as much, yeah. And I think the Mongolian women helped fight too. They were archers, yeah, and they were just really savage. They were badasses. They were very Spartan. They would eat when a mare would give birth to a colt. They would eat the placenta as part of the food and drink all the blood, and they would eat the parasites, like the ticks that were eating off of their horses and off of their own head, and they would dress in leather made from mice, and their one and only goal was to just ride their horses down the pasture and take over the world and kill everybody, because they're all under the control of the great Genghis Khan, who was going to take over the whole world. And yeah, and Genghis Khan professed that he was the embodiment of evil. The Pope sent a emissary out to him, saying, "Yes, I hope you become Christian. I hope you don't attack us." And Genghis Khan said, "I will not bow down to any other god. I am God, and I am God's wrath. I am the answer to all of your iniquities." So Genghis Khan must have heard of iniquities. That I guess maybe by then there had been some Turks who had invaded, who had problems with that was right after the Crusades. So they had heard of all the nasty, vicious, cannibalistic, brutal acts that the Christian Crusaders had perpetrated over the Turks, who were related to the Mongols, and the Islamics. So they're like, "We are the answer to your crusades. We are the crusade of your crusade. We are the answer to your iniquity, and I am the wrath of God, evil force." Yeah. Ra, the Venusian aliens, say that Genghis Khan reincarnated as he works in a trade bureau or something on the evil Orion planet or something. But anyways, so yeah, China got taken over by those dudes, and that was called the Yuan Dynasty, and they were in charge for 100 years, and then they kind of got taken over by some real Chinese who knew what they were doing, and I think that was the Mings? Because the Ming Dynasty was in charge for 300 years, from 1600 until 1911. So I guess maybe there was some other dynasty or whatever. And then, of course, then later on the Europeans started coming over to China and wanting to do trade with them. Marco Polo went over there in about the 1200s. So I guess it was Marco Polo who was the one who went there during the Yuan Dynasty, right after all of those Mongolian invasions, and so he was maybe the one who reported about all of the different perpetrate all the fat that got melted onto the road. I just noticed there's this like really fast bike racer chick who just passed, so I got distracted. Try to film her when she comes back. Yeah, so but he reported on a whole bunch of stuff about China, like how advanced they were. China was really advanced. They had invented a lot of cool stuff. There was one dude, I don't know when this was, it could have been any time around then, about 1,000 years ago, or, right before the Wands or whatever. But there was one dude who invented an earthquake detector. That it was this big, tall spire that stood straight up and had a flat top with a big round ball on the top. And it was balanced just so. And so if there was an earthquake from like over there, the earth would come and then it would knock the thing that way, and then the ball would fall off. So the direction that the ball fell off is where the earthquake was. And so they used that, I guess, to help prepare to send aid and stuff. But one day the ball fell off, but nobody felt anything. So they said, oh, your thing is crap. It doesn't work. But then 6 days later, somebody came with word that 650 kilometers away there was an earthquake. Yeah, I think there were lots of earthquakes in China. I think that's an earthquake zone because it's near the Ring of Fire. That big ring where the plates, the Eurasia plate and the Pacific plate come together. The Ring of Fire is also right here in the Pacific Northwest and west in the San Andreas Fault and stuff. So they had earthquakes. I remember seeing when I was a kid a Marco Polo movie, and in the movie there was a big earthquake and all these people died. But they invented the compass that armies used to get around. There was a definitive report of a compass in 1200 in China, and the first compass didn't become getting in use in Europe until the 1500s, and it originally came in through the Venusians, who were doing trade with the Chinese. Marco Polo was a Venusian, so when he came back in like 1250, Marco Polo had a really interesting life. When he was like 15, he went with his brothers, made it all the way to China. He was in China 20 years, or he was traveling 20 years, and finally came back to Venice, and he was like, 35? He was still pretty young after being gone 20 years. And then he died an old man in Venice, and he wrote the books and told the stories and got people motivated. And that was basically the beginning of people wanting to travel around and get going. So yeah, they started the trade, and they were doing the Silk Route trade at that point. It was just the overland through Transoxiana and stuff. So that gave, the Middle East wealth and all that. But also the Chinese invented this thing, the south-pointing chariot. And I don't know how it knew which way was south. They never explained that in the documentary that I saw, because I thought the only thing that could detect the direction pointed north, your compass. But they had this chariot where there was this like god, immortal upon the chariot, who he was always facing south. So they pulled the chariot around and they knew which way south was to help them get around. Because I guess there's big deserts and stuff. They also invented a big carriage that could travel with wind power. I guess there's a certain area in China where it's really windy, and so yeah, they would get in those chariots, those little carriages, and they could move 200 miles a day on that wind powered chariot, carrying 30 people. And I remember seeing one of those movies. I think it was Hero. It was like 10 years ago. That movie with Jet Li, and in one of the scenes, you see him in the desert, and there's like 30 dudes in this giant chariot just barreling down the road at like 30 miles an hour with this big mast on it. And I remember thinking, that's beautiful, that's amazing, but man, those Chinese, they've got an imagination, don't they? They never had that, but apparently they did. When I see some movies, Chinese movies, and you see fantastic, amazing stuff, my original reaction was, geez, these Chinese, they don't know how to make historical movies that are accurate. This is totally unrealistic, but maybe it's true. I saw this movie called Red Cliff. And I think Red Cliff is the story. It's a Chinese movie, which is really well made. And it's like 2 parts. It's like 4 hours long. And it's made to tell the story of the overthrow of one of those big dynasties, like the Ming Dynasty or something, by one of the other warlords. I can't remember when that was, but the dude who came over from the big Ming Dynasty to take over the rebels, in the movie, you see him with like hundreds of thousands of ships. And I don't know, maybe it's kind of accurate. Maybe there were lots of ships like that, you know? Pretty interesting. Let's see. Also, some other inventions that they made. They invented. I don't remember what they did writing. They'd have writing down for a long time, and they invented paper. This dude named Kai Lun, in like 105 AD, invented paper. And so they were communicating with paper, and of course they have paper in their houses, which dividers in their houses, which in their rooms. That's the Japanese. I think that's the Chinese thing too. But so that's they were, in a lot of ways, they're more advanced than Europeans. Their engineering feats were a lot more impressive. They also made canals throughout China, not just doing traveling through the rivers, but also connecting rivers with canals. They, and through hundreds of years, they had been expanding their canals, but they made one canal. I think they made it like 1,600 miles long in like just only 15 years with it was one of these big, huge, powerful emperors who commissioned the project. And then he took a big river trip down it to like commemorate the opening of the canal. And he went down with his big boat and having his meals and his parties on the boat going down the canal. And all the peasants saw it and they were like, we worked for that. So then they rebelled and they overthrew him. I don't remember who that was. I remember hearing that on Engineering Empire History Channel. It's Peter Weller saying it. So, and then, what else did they invent? They invented the crossbow a long ass time ago, which was really fast. And they invented the stirrup, and which allows you to ride a horse with a lot of armor on so that you don't bust your balls. And I think they introduced it to the Europeans, and so the Europeans started using the stirrup in like the Middle Ages, so the knights could ride around in all their armor. And they invented that canal. They made that canal in a whole bunch of ways. They even destroyed a mountain. I don't remember which year this was, man. I'll have to do a China Part 2 video sometime, but they actually destroyed a mountain. This is in like 500 BC or something, a long ass time ago. They destroyed a mountain by making these big fires on it and making the rocks really hot and then pouring water all over it and then cracking the rocks and then carting the rocks off that way. And they made the mountain go completely away so that they could divert a river to go through there and put more irrigation into that big Han Chinese Valley. So if you look at the Han Chinese Valley from a satellite photo nowadays and you see that huge area of green with all the rivers going through it and all the towns and stuff, that's like an artificial creation. That's a product of years and years of canals, of diverting rivers to pass right through there. And because it's right at the base of those big mountains, right up north of that, a few hundred miles, because Beijing is kind of really close to the mountains. And on the top of the mountains is where the Great Wall of China is. So all that water comes and just goes right into Beijing and through that area. And and at one point, I think this isn't about the 1400s. Or the 13 or 1400s. One of those Chinese emperors fabulously wealthy dudes. Because ever since Shi Huangdi unified China back in 221 BC, the Chinese were used to the idea and open to the idea of being a unified country, because that whole river valley system was one unit of area, and so they could travel around easily. So yeah, they liked the idea of having one king who could administer all of that for everybody. You know, he could be really rich and he could build lots of stuff, and all the people could build it, and it could be this big national pride thing. So this one king invented, this one emperor created like tons of ships. I think he had 1,200 ships and like 1,000 sailors or something. He had just as many sailors as the Spanish Armada and twice as many ships. And a lot of those ships were really, really, really big. One of them was about 450 feet long, and it had like 1,000 sailors just on the one ship. Oh, so maybe they had a lot more. Or it had like 800 sailors just on that one ship. Yeah, so I think maybe the whole fleet had like, oh man, I don't know how many. I'd like to know. I should definitely search that. Because they had thousands and thousands. And they built those ships on dry docks. I think they invented the dry dock. And the first people to make dry docks. And then they sailed down to India, like the southern tip of India, and all those ships. And then the emperor died in India somehow, with a fever or something. So then the other dude who took over turned the boats around and went back to China. And then the new emperor, he wasn't so into what that other emperor was doing. So he he had all the ships burnt to the ground, like 1,200 huge ass ships. Oh, there's that girl. Freaking fat badass. Dun 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 dun. Anyways, so yeah, he wasn't so into that whole adventure thing. So he had them all burnt down, and ever since then, they had been an insular country where they were only interested in themselves, because they had that big ass area with all those people, just being rich enough, being wealthy enough, and they probably knew that if he got too big, then it was too much for his kingdom to control, and they didn't want to have wars with anybody because their contact with other foreigners were the Mongols, and so they thought everybody else who would come into China was inferior to them, and they were the tip top, they were the best, and they didn't need anything else, and so that's why they didn't want to create big ocean-going ships and sail all the way around the whole world, and they were just perfectly fine. So back in like 1650, or when was it? Maybe it was like 1850. King George III, whoever he was, whenever he lived, he sent an emissary to China and wanted to do trade. And so the Chinese dude said, okay, well, you have to kowtow to me. And kowtow means, literally in Chinese, it's a Chinese word. It means hit your head to the ground. So you have to bow to me and bang your head on the ground to show that I am the great authority, central authority figure. And that's actually, that whole idea came from Confucianism back 2,500 years ago, where the emperor is supposed to be the all-powerful man who makes wise decision for all the people, and he is as the North Star, because as though is the North Star that all the other stars revolve around, and he is never changing. The great emperor is never changing, and all the other stars revolve around him. So great emperor must sit in the north, and everybody to the south, looking northward to a great emperor with great northern star of emperor's head, and we all revolve around him, and we kowtow to him. So, anyways, the emperor wanted that British emissary to kowtow to him, but the guy was like, okay, well, I'll kowtow to you. It's not my custom. She's like, kowtow. She's like, well, I'll kowtow to you if you kowtow to a portrait of my king. And he's like, I ain't kowtowing to no king. So he's like, I ain't kowtowing to you. So, and I guess he couldn't have kowtowed anyway because he had gout. But he was like, all right, well, I ain't doing business with you. And this is why. So he wrote the letter back to the king. And the king's like, I shall not do business with you. I have everything that I need. And also, I guess the king wanted to install a European diplomat, ambassador within the court of the Chinese king, and that's something that the Europeans, that was part of European custom, the European the court of like the king always had. In the court, you know what I mean? Like inside of their castle, and they're hanging out all day on top of their throne, watching all the people below them talking and mingling and eating food and doing dealings and doing their deciding what to do in the laws and stuff. Well, inside that room, they also had representatives of all the other countries around. Like if you watch that movie, The Tudors, with King Henry VIII, you see that other dude. He was always making an appearance, and he was the ambassador for Spain. And so England wanted to install one in China, but I guess that's not part of Chinese culture. I guess they didn't. It was more all the different kingdoms, Japan and China. They didn't have each other's people installed in each other's courts. They had a different system to kind of maintain loyalty, and where like one of the sons of the king, or at least in Japan it was like this, one of the sons of the shoguns would have to move in with the family of the other shogun and be like an adopted type of guest who they would treat well. They would educate and treat like aristocracy, but in case the other king went back on any of his promises, well, he could kill the dude's son. So yeah, but I guess Chinese weren't into having anybody installed in their court. And the emperor maybe had more power. That's just how it was for them. So the English went back and they were like, huh. But then they wanted to do some more trade, and eventually they went back in like 1850, and they started doing trade with the Chinese, but they were trading opium. And they made a bunch of money on opium, and everybody in China got addicted to opium. And so China became, and then people started killing themselves on opium, and China's like economy went down, and it was really bad for China. And the Emperor of China actually sent a letter to Queen Victoria saying, why are you allowing these smugglers? I don't think she officially allowed them to do it, but I don't think she was really tried that hard to snuff it out. And she's like, why are you letting these English people come in and bring us our opium? Don't you have it? You have it illegal in your country, so you know it's bad. Why are you letting it happen here? And so I think the Chinese wanted to kick the English out. So they, but the English by then, they had been going through the Industrial Revolution, and the Chinese hadn't, and so they had a war, and the English kicked the Chinese asses because they had cannons on the side of their ships and they had guns, and the Chinese were fighting them with crossbows. So China started to go downhill, basically, you could say, when that one emperor burnt all those ships and didn't want to continue off into Europe. I mean, if he had to use those ships and jumped in those ships and continued into Europe, they could have colonized. Maybe they could have even have started colonies on Europe and done trade with Europe, and then they would have come back to China all motivated. Oh, we got to kick these Europeans' asses because they got some weapons. And but yeah, so I guess China was more advanced in that way, and that they weren't such a warlike culture. They didn't. If they were fighting with crossbows, they must have been peaceful enough to not have to try. Because necessity is the mother of all invention. And so yeah, they fought the British, and the British beat them. And so then the British made up a treaty that they could continue to trade with them, but they get to have their trade base, and that was Hong Kong. because back then Hong Kong was just an island that wasn't even inhabited for some reason. So then the British went there, and they built their big skyscrapers. I guess it's the best skyline in the whole world, better than New York. And they did their trade with China, but that was after the end of the Opium Wars. After that, and then they made like the treaty where England has to give it back after 150 years. So they gave it back to China in 1997, and then China. But China had some problems. Like in the 20th century wasn't a really good century for China because China, the Ming Dynasty collapsed in 1911 because because it was basically time. It didn't collapse in a big revolution or anything like that. It just kind of like fizzled out because I guess they were just too rich, China had become industrialized, so its infrastructure had gotten a lot bigger, and people were getting a lot wealthier, and so they had to make a lot of like political decisions based on like the welfare of the people, and those Ming dynasties, they were just kind of shut away in their forbidden city where nobody. It was called the Forbidden City because nobody is allowed even in the city, even Chinese. Only the royal family could go in there, and then the workers for the royal family. So they were really closed off, and that's why they didn't allow King George's emissary to go in and be part of the court. They were, and so that didn't jive well with the Industrial Revolution, where there needed to be lots of open communication. And so the Ming Dynasty collapsed, and so now I don't know where the descendants of them are doing nowadays, but it totally went down, and there's no more of that. And then they got invaded by the Japanese Empire and kind of got their asses kicked by the Japanese because the Japanese were becoming very industrial and had the warships and everything. And so they had battles and stuff, but they beat the Chinese and took over China. And then the Japanese lost World War II and got kicked out of China. And China was free again. And so China had to decide what political system that they were going to go and be now. So they went into communism, kind of like, and they had problems with communism. Communism wasn't didn't treat people very well for a long time. It was kind of like the communism of Russia. The communism of China and the communism of Russia was very similar, where you'd have like Joseph Stalin just moving millions of people up to Siberia and then shuffling all these people around and send them to the Gulag and killing them all and making this oligarchy that could control everybody, all in the name of communism and the good of the people. So I think they had kind of a rough time with that. The same reason that the Russians did, because it was such a sudden change. It wasn't a gradual change from transition from a monarchy. Like in England, it went from a monarchy to a constitutional monarchy to a parliamentary to, what we have now is just like parliament, elected parliament. And from like in Russia and China, it went from being absolute monarchy to now what? To something that's absolute. It's just called communism, and but it's still absolute because they had a big civil war, Chiang Kai-shek versus Mao Zedong, and Mao Zedong ended up winning, and because Chiang Kai-shek wasn't a nice guy, he was just a warlord, a very vicious guy, probably would have tried to install himself as emperor. Mao wins, and he's in charge for like 50 years, and then China kind of does their imperial thing, and they invaded Tibet back in like 1955 or something, and nobody came to Tibet's aid. They asked for aid, but nobody came, and I think maybe one reason nobody came to Tibet's aid was because back in the Industrial Revolution. And England was out there playing the great game with Russia, trying to fight for supremacy, for influence over over like India and Afghanistan and Pakistan and Tibet and stuff. That's why Afghanistan has that like little thing that comes out into all those other countries. It's because the Russians and the English had the countries on either side, and Afghanistan was kind of like the neutral country, and so they put that in there so that they wouldn't have to fight over borders. But the English tried to exert some influence in Tibet, and so that they set up a whole bunch of telegraph lines in Tibet, to try to modernize Tibet. And Tibet tore all those under the leadership of the Dalai Lamas. This is in like, World War I or something, 1900. Tibet tore all those down. They didn't want none of that, so maybe England threw up their arms to them and were like, all right, whatever then. So then the Chinese came and took them over. And right now, Tibet, I think it's too late for Tibet. I don't think Tibet could be its own independent country now. And especially these days, I think we should bring all the countries together, meld countries together, like basically turn America and Canada into one country, and then America, Canada, and Mexico into one country. And so yeah, I think Tibet and China might as well just be the same country, with maybe Tibet being its own state. But right now, there's more Chinese living in Tibet than Tibetans. There's 9 million, at least as of 1997, there were 9 million Chinese and 7 million Tibetans. Because when the Chinese took over, then they colonized Tibet. They killed a bunch of Tibetans and colonized Tibet. They destroyed all of the monasteries in Tibet. And there has been recently a resurgence of monasteries in Tibet, but that's due to funding from outside sources, like philanthropists from America and stuff like that, but not from the country of China. China, Buddhism was a big religion in China also, but the Buddhism of China wasn't as peaceful as the Buddhism of Tibet and Bhutan, and India. There was one empress, I can't remember her name, maybe she was the only empress of China, who originally was a concubine, and then I guess somehow she became empress, called herself emperor, and she reigned until she was like in her 80s, reigned for a long time, and she was not a good emperor. She was very vicious and ruthless, and but she was a Buddhist, and she claimed to be the reincarnation of the Buddha. So it kind of got the idea of Buddhists, being kind of like warlike in China. And I saw a riot that Buddhists in Korea did when I was in Korea. They were turning over cars and stuff, all dressed in their robes while they were doing it. They had the gray robes there. But and then, of course, there's the Shaolin monks. Aren't they supposed to be Buddhist? And they're all like karate fighters and they kill you. But yeah, Chinese, like Confucianism and Buddhism kind of don't really, or at least Chinese Confucianism and Chinese Buddhism don't really get along, because Confucianism is kind of an atheistic religion. It's more of a political science religion. It's just a bunch of sayings of societal rules that you have to do in order to keep a healthy, peaceful society, and so when Buddhists came in there and Buddhists set up monasteries, kind of like how the Christians do, where the monks are in there praying all day long, and you're supposed to give 1/10 of your earnings to the monks to have good merit for you. I mean, it's really similar, the whole Buddhist monk monastery philosophy, give your extra money to the monk, and the Catholic priest monastery, give some of your money to the Catholic Church philosophy. It's really similar. And they had to rebel against the Catholic Church because they were taking too much money to build St. Peter's Cathedral and buying entrances into heaven and stuff. And of course, they had to rebel against that because it got out of hand. It was probably similar to that in China, where they saw all of these different Chinese, these Buddhist monasteries all over the place, just sucking up the resources of the country, with all these monks locked behind, like not doing anything for anybody, just like meditating for you and praying for you, and so they wanted to get rid of them. And so throughout time, the Chinese Confucianists like tore down those monasteries and said, no, we're not gonna, that's not right. We don't want to it, we only need to pay for stuff that's good for society. And so that was maybe some of the motivation behind attacking Tibet and tearing down those monasteries. They just wanted to modernize Tibet because they saw that Tibet had torn down the phone lines, the telegraph lines that the English set up. And so now it was their turn to take down Tibet and modernize them and colonize them. Basically, when I was in Tibet, I saw a whole bunch of Chinese-looking buildings, which I don't think are pretty. Chinese are really into porcelain, into pottery, and they like to line their buildings with plates of pottery, with little pottery plates put on the side of their building, and like mosaics and stuff. If it's a mosaic, it's pretty, but if it's just like all over the side, I didn't think that was pretty. I was like, huh. But it was all over Tibet. And they're really good at pottery. Like, for example, like I said, the Terracotta Army, those guys were cooked at 2,000 degrees like nobody, and they're still in really good shape now. You know, nobody else was doing it in that quality. And then the English, when King George III brought his emissary over, he brought gifts. And they brought their porcelain over, and they thought that they were going to impress the Chinese with it. And he's like, "Look at our porcelain. You want to buy some of this?" And he's like, "What? This is not as good as what we have." So yeah, they were really good at pottery. But anyways, they took over Tibet, and also some people think that they took over Tibet because Tibet is really high altitude, really closest part of China to Europe and India, who they've had border squabbles with, and so they thought that they could put a whole bunch of like nuclear silos up there. And so maybe I saw a lot of Chinese army and stuff up there. So they took over Tibet, and they've been complaining ever since. But China had kind of a rough 20th century because I guess they took that Confucianism thing too far, plugging into the communism, and they just maintained an oligarchy. And, you know, communism, having a state government that pays for a lot of the people and stuff is great, but not if it's an oligarchy, because then people there's no line of communication, and people don't have any human connection, and they were killing lots of people. They would send people, it was basically the equivalent of Russia in the Gulag camps. They'd send all these Chinese farmer workers, and if they were not part of the Communist Party, they'd send them to way off to the work camps and then murder them, and crazy human rights abuses. And then become like way industrialized. They polluted the Yellow River and put their Chinese river dolphin into extinction a few years ago. But their economy is growing at 13% a year, and now they own all of America's debt, and they took over Japan in GDP. Now they're the second strongest GDP. They passed Japan last year. They're set to pass America within about 6 years. And and once they, call our debts back, they're probably going to become the next world, the strongest. Once they become the strongest GDP, become the strongest superpower in terms of manufacturing, all of the cars and, not just like cheap little toys, but like cars and computers and all kinds of like high tech goods are going to come out of China, and the quality of living in China is going to go up, and they're going to, your average Chinese is going to be making as much as your average like American, which is a good thing. And it's nothing to be freaked out about. It's about time, because they worked their asses off like slaves for a long time, and it's payback. It's time for them to get their due. But I think that they'll be able to transfer into a good political system pretty soon. That's actually may even be a better political system than even America, because they are very communist minded. They're very community minded. They're very socialist oriented, I think, all the way due to, all those Confucianism ideas, where they were the first people to have Social Security. And so creating. That's what America needs more. I think America needs to go a little bit. We need to have a national health care system. I don't know how it's done. I'm sure we can afford it if we just don't spend 20% of our budget on defense. China doesn't spend 20% of their budget on defense. Nobody else spends that much of their budget on defense. So once we all like stop freaking out about each other and realize that we can make political decisions on the table and with words rather than like invading and shooting people, which is going to become old pretty soon and out of date. I think we're going to be able to, we're all going to be going towards the socialism route. And having free healthcare for everybody, whether you work or not, and state-owned banking system, state-owned, that's controlled by people who we vote in, and then you vote them out, and then we all know how the rules are because the educational system is good, and China I think is going to do quite well with that because they have a really good mindset of cooperation, group cooperation, and group work, and working hard, and following rules. And also they do, I think, have some like progressive ideas as terms of ownership. They don't believe in property rights so much as like we do, where if you like invent something, you get to collect royalties on it. Well, in China, if you invent something, it goes to the state, and we all share. And so I think that's a good mindset that we can all have. And when we have a really strong GDP where people don't have to fight over money so much anyways. So yeah, that's basically history of China as far as I know it.